Support for makers comes from Bank of America and by Cypress Cove.
In 1945, because at the end of the war, there were pictures in the Kansas City Star of liberated prisoners from concentration camps. And the stories about 6 million Jews had been killed. And it affected me so. I said to myself, my God, why did I not get killed? Why was I saved? And I decided there had to be a purpose somewhere. I grew up in Vienna, and in 1938, Hitler took over Austria, and the same laws against Jews applied. So there we were again, and this time it wasn't so easy to get out of there. I was 12 years old, and probably the most serious moment was Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was the night of broken glass, when synagogues were smashed and 30,000 young men were put into concentration camps. That afternoon, there was a knock on the door, and when my mother opened the door, there stood 2 SS men. So they marched into the apartment and said, okay, we want your money and your jewelry. This was part of the retribution that Hitler decreed because a young man had assassinated the French ambassador to Germany in Paris because his parents had been dragged off to a concentration camp. And Hitler decreed that all Jews were to pay a fine for this. My older brother ended up in a detention holding area in a gymnasium where he, with 200 other people, were kept. And fortunately, he had a letter with him from his company he worked for, Shell Oil, who took care of all its Jewish employees and got them visas. So because he had a way out, he was let go. But he came home looking like a skeleton. He'd lost 20 pounds and had whip marks on his back and refused to talk. We were underage children, and they needed a letter of credit. And there was nobody to give the letter of credit in America. So it looked pretty sad. And by a miracle of God, we got an invitation to come to the American consulate for physical exams in January. And we still don't understand how that happened, except my father had been, I guess, a war hero in World War I. We came here in 1939, April, 2 days before our deadline, April 13th, 1939. I was going to University of Kansas City, and my mother had become the law librarian there. So my tuition was very reasonable. And I had actually earned enough money scrubbing floors, washing dishes, doing all kinds of things to raise my money for my tuition. I said, you have to go to my parents for my hand. After all, they're European and they expect that. So he went to see them, and they said, we didn't raise a hand to be a house frau to wash clothes, iron, and cook. I taught German at the University of Kansas and at the University of Missouri at Kansas City. When I was pregnant with my first child, I was highly pregnant. I said to the administration, look, I just can't do this anymore. The kids were all in camp, and the house was kind of empty. And I thought, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? So I looked up careers for women in the United States. And this is now 50 years ago. And the choices were three: nurse, teacher, or social worker. Well, I'd done a lot of volunteer work, and the closest thing that interested me was social work. So that's why I went back and got my master's in social work. A teacher, seventh grade teacher, came to us asking for money for an exhibit he was trying to put together called Out of the Ashes, which was to teach his class about the Holocaust. And I felt that we should honor that and give him money. Well, for a couple of years, he went to schools and exhibits at university, and then suddenly landed in a storage place. And it worried me that it would stay there forever. And I had the vision, why don't we make a museum out of it? It is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. And it has grown tremendously. I think over the past 10 years, we have educated 27,000 school children. The emphasis in the Holocaust Museum is we need to learn from history so we don't repeat the same things. And we put a heavy emphasis on genocide. I guess I have been a spokesperson in some ways of minorities, and women have certainly been the minority in many cases. I think it's all a part of equality and having our rights, our voices heard in this country, of all places. I still don't think that women's salaries, compensations are equal to men's compensations. And there's still a lot of work to be done. I tell my story to school children at the museum, and I've had some unbelievable experiences with that. Kids identify, I'm telling them a story about a 12 and 13-year-old, and that's how old they are. The thing that guided me was if people could communicate with each other, get to know each other as human beings and people, that things like this wouldn't happen.
Support for Makers comes from Clive Daniel Home and by Chico's.